In the summer of 1931, China faced one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history, the 1931 China floods, also known as the Yangtze Huai River floods. Spanning from June to August, these floods devastated central and eastern China, leaving a trail of destruction and loss across major cities like Wuhan, Nanjing, and beyond. This catastrophe was not just an isolated event, but the culmination of a series of extreme weather conditions that had plagued the region for several years. The backstory of these floods begins in the late 1920s, when China was already grappling with severe droughts from 1928 to 1930. These droughts had a significant impact on the country, drying up rivers and reducing water levels to dangerous lows. But the winter of 1930 brought a harsh twist, as heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures covered the mountainous areas with thick layers of snow and ice. As the winter gave way to spring in 1931, this snow and ice began to melt, and the resulting water flowed downstream into the Yangtze River. Ordinarily, the Yangtze River and its surrounding areas experience seasonal flooding during the spring, summer, and fall. However, the continuous melting combined with heavy rainfall in early 1931 created a situation that was far from ordinary. By June, those living in low-lying areas along the river had already been forced to abandon their homes as water levels rose at an alarming rate. The summer of 1931 was marked by intense cyclonic activity, with 9 cyclones hitting the region in July alone, far above the average of 2 per year. These cyclones brought unprecedented amounts of rain, further swelling the rivers and causing water levels to reach new heights. By the time the floodwaters peaked in August, much of central and eastern China was underwater. The floodwaters inundated an area of about 180,000 square kilometers, roughly equivalent in size to the combined states of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Cities like Wuhan were submerged, and the scale of the disaster was so immense that it quickly overwhelmed local authorities and communities. This introduction sets the stage for understanding how the 1931 floods developed into one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in human history. The combination of natural factors, ranging from severe droughts and harsh winters to unrelenting cyclones, created a perfect storm that would lead to untold devastation in the months to come. As we move forward, we'll explore how these events unfolded, the sheer scale of destruction that followed, and the lasting impact of this disaster on China and its people. As 1931 began, a series of environmental conditions converged to create the perfect storm for what would become one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. In the years leading up to the flood, China had experienced a long drought from 1928 to 1930, which left the ground parched and unable to absorb water effectively. The winter of 1930-1931 was particularly harsh, with severe cold spells that deposited large amounts of snow and ice across the mountainous regions. This snow and ice were set to become a major factor in the unfolding disaster. As the harsh winter gave way to spring, the snow and ice began to melt rapidly, sending torrents of water downstream into the Yangtze River and its tributaries. Ordinarily, this region would experience 3 distinct periods of high water: spring, summer, and fall. But in 1931, the water flow was relentless, combining all 3 high water periods into one continuous, overwhelming deluge. As early as June, the situation was already dire, with heavy rains compounding the melting snow and ice. The Yangtze River swelled to levels not seen since records began, causing those living in low-lying areas to abandon their homes in fear of what was to come. Adding to the chaos, the summer of 1931 saw an unprecedented level of cyclonic activity. 9 cyclones struck the region in July alone, a sharp increase from the usual 2 per year. The torrential rains brought by these storms saturated the ground further, with 4 weather stations along the Yangtze River reporting rainfall exceeding 600 millimeters for the month. The river, already swollen from months of heavy water flow, reached dangerously high levels, pushing against dikes and levees that had held firm for decades. Despite the growing danger, preparations for such a catastrophe were minimal. The flood control infrastructure, already weakened by years of neglect and mismanagement, was simply not equipped to handle the massive volume of water. Communities along the river, already strained from years of drought and economic hardship, were caught off guard by the severity of the situation. Efforts to strengthen dikes and build temporary barriers were quickly overwhelmed as the water levels continued to rise. By late July, it was clear that a disaster of unprecedented scale was imminent. The river's water levels were now at their highest point in living memory, and the first signs of flooding began to appear in low-lying areas. People scrambled to save what they could, but the sheer magnitude of the impending flood left little time for effective evacuation. The stage was set for the 1931 China floods to unleash their full fury on the unsuspecting population. The catastrophic impact of the 1931 China floods began to fully manifest in August. The relentless rains continued, and the Yangtze River, along with other major rivers like the Huai and Yellow Rivers, could no longer contain the immense volume of water. On August 1st, the Yangtze River burst its banks, and the floodwaters surged into the surrounding countryside, overwhelming dikes and inundating vast areas of land. Entire towns and villages were swallowed by the advancing waters. The floods swept through the landscape with unstoppable force, destroying homes, farmlands, and infrastructure. Roads and railways were submerged, cutting off communication and transportation routes, making it nearly impossible for aid to reach the affected areas. The situation was dire, and the people caught in the flood's path had little chance to escape. As the floodwaters spread, the scale of the devastation became clearer. The city of Wuhan, one of China's most important industrial and commercial centers, was among the hardest hit. The city was submerged under several feet of water, leaving only the tops of buildings visible in some areas. The residents of Wuhan, along with millions of others across the floodplain, were forced to seek refuge on rooftops, in trees, and on any high ground they could find. Many clung to makeshift rafts or debris, desperately trying to survive. In the countryside, the situation was even more grim. The floodwaters turned fertile farmlands into vast muddy lakes. Crops that were nearing harvest were destroyed, leading to widespread food shortages. Livestock drowned in the rising waters, further exacerbating the looming famine. The floods also displaced millions of people, leaving them homeless and without access to clean water, food, or medical care. The death toll began to climb rapidly. Drowning claimed the lives of countless individuals in the immediate aftermath of the flood, but the disaster's impact went far beyond the initial surge of water. The stagnant floodwaters became breeding grounds for disease, and epidemics of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever spread rapidly through the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions in which survivors were forced to live. Malnutrition and exposure to the elements further weakened the already vulnerable population. The government, already stretched thin by economic troubles and political instability, struggled to respond effectively to the crisis. Relief efforts were hampered by the scale of the disaster and the sheer number of people in need. Local authorities and international aid organizations did what they could, but resources were limited and the needs were overwhelming. As the floodwaters slowly receded, they left behind a landscape of devastation. The physical destruction was immense, but the human toll was even greater. The 1931 China floods were not just a natural disaster, but a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The country would be left to grapple with the aftermath for years to come. In the aftermath of the 1931 China floods, the devastation was almost unimaginable. As the floodwaters gradually receded, they revealed a landscape utterly transformed by the disaster. Farmlands that had once been lush and fertile were now barren, coated in a thick layer of silt and debris. The flood had destroyed crops, homes, and infrastructure, leaving millions of people without shelter or means of livelihood. The immediate concern in the weeks following the flood was the humanitarian crisis. With millions of people displaced, there was an urgent need for food, clean water, and medical care. Relief efforts were mounted, but they were hampered by the sheer scale of the disaster. Roads and railways remained damaged or submerged, making it difficult to transport supplies to the worst affected areas. The government, already struggling with internal political instability, found it challenging to coordinate a response on such a massive scale. In the refugee camps that sprung up across the region, conditions were dire. Overcrowding and unsanitary living conditions led to the rapid spread of diseases. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever claimed thousands of lives, adding to the already staggering death toll. The lack of adequate food supplies resulted in widespread malnutrition, and many survivors succumbed to hunger and disease. The social impact of the floods was profound. Families were torn apart, with many losing loved ones to the floodwaters or the subsequent epidemics. The loss of homes and livelihoods meant that entire communities were plunged into poverty, with little hope of recovery in the near term. The psychological trauma of the disaster left deep scars on the survivors, many of whom had witnessed unimaginable horrors during the flood. The economic consequences were equally severe. The destruction of farmlands and the loss of the harvest led to food shortages and skyrocketing prices. The The agricultural sector, which was the backbone of China's economy at the time, was decimated. This in turn led to a sharp increase in poverty and unemployment, as farmers and laborers found themselves without work. The disaster also had long-term political repercussions. The government's inadequate response to the crisis fueled public dissatisfaction and unrest. The inability to provide effective relief and the perceived indifference of the authorities to the suffering of the people undermined the government's legitimacy and contributed to the growing sense of discontent across the country. International aid did arrive, but it was not enough to meet the overwhelming needs of the affected population. While various relief organizations and foreign governments provided assistance, the scale of the disaster meant that many people continued to suffer for months and even years after the floodwaters had receded. The 1931 China floods were a turning point in the nation's history. They exposed the vulnerabilities of the country's infrastructure and governance and highlighted the need for better disaster preparedness and response. The lessons learned from this catastrophe would eventually lead to changes in flood control measures and disaster management strategies, but for those who lived through it, the impact of the floods would be felt for a lifetime. The legacy of the 1931 China floods is a somber reminder of the catastrophic power of natural disasters and the profound impact they can have on society. In the years that followed, efforts were made to prevent such a tragedy from occurring again. The government began investing in more comprehensive flood control measures, including the construction of dams, levees, and improved drainage systems. These initiatives were aimed at better managing the country's vast river systems and reducing the risk of future floods. One of the key lessons learned from the 1931 floods was the importance of early warning systems in disaster preparedness. The lack of timely information and coordinated response had exacerbated the scale of the disaster. In response, meteorological and hydrological monitoring systems were gradually improved, allowing for more accurate predictions of potential floods and better planning for evacuation and relief efforts. However, the memory of the 1931 floods also served as a stark reminder of the need for sustainable development and environmental stewardship. Deforestation, land reclamation, and other practices that disrupted natural water flows were recognized as contributing factors to the severity of the floods. This realization led to increased awareness of the importance of protecting natural ecosystems as a means of mitigating the impact of future floods. On a social level, the floods had a lasting impact on the people of China. The survivors carried with them the trauma and loss of the disaster, and the event became a defining moment in the collective memory of the nation. It was a time of immense suffering, but also of resilience, as communities came together to rebuild their lives in the aftermath. The 1931 China floods remain one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history, with an estimated death toll ranging from 1 million to 4 million people. The exact number may never be known, but the scale of the tragedy is undeniable. The disaster highlighted the need for stronger infrastructure, better disaster preparedness, and a more compassionate response to those in need. In the decades since, China has made significant strides in disaster management and flood control. Modern technology and improved infrastructure have reduced the risk of such a catastrophic event occurring again. Yet, the memory of the 1931 floods continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance, preparation, and the human cost of environmental neglect. As we reflect on the 1931 China floods, we are reminded of the delicate balance between nature and human civilization. It is a balance that requires constant attention and respect, for when it is disrupted, the consequences can be devastating. The floods of 1931 are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity and a sobering reminder of the need to protect our environment and prepare for the challenges that nature may bring.